The mist had not yet lifted from the river when Maeve Alden knelt by the cold water of Silver Creek, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her hands red from the chill. The early morning fog hung thick over the river, hiding the pine trees and the far bank. This was the only hour of the day that belonged entirely to her, a quiet time before her aunt and cousin woke up in the old house on the hill. Nobody watched her here, and nobody could whisper about her mother or compare her to her cousin's bright beauty. In the silence of the dawn, there was only the steady rush of the water and the heavy wet linen in her basket. She liked the quiet because it did not ask anything of her, and it did not judge her for her plain clothes. On the old stone bridge above the water, half hidden by the sweeping branches of a wild willow tree, a rider had stopped his horse. Gabriel Winter had ridden out before the sun could rise, trying to escape the loud guests at his estate who constantly wanted things from him. He did not expect to find anyone in this quiet, forgotten corner of the valley, but then he saw her. She was a young woman in a simple gray dress, her dark hair coming loose from its pins as she worked. She moved with a calm, steady rhythm, washing the clothes with hands that had clearly done this task every single morning of her life. There was no sadness in her posture, only a quiet acceptance of the work. Gabriel should have turned his horse and ridden away, as a gentleman of his standing had no business staring at a young woman working. Yet he found himself unable to move, drawn to the quiet strength she showed in the cold morning air. His white hair fell across his pale forehead as he leaned forward, watching her pause to look at the sky. He was not a normal man. He was the master of the valley, a vampire king who had lived for over 100 years. Yet he had never seen anyone look so peaceful while doing such hard work. For 10 years he had kept people at a distance, but this stranger made him forget his caution. Maeve did not see him, but she felt a strange warmth, like a quiet gaze resting on her shoulders. She brushed a lock of dark hair from her face and looked up at the pale light coming through the trees. The air was cold, but the light felt good on her skin. She finished her work, twisting the heavy sheets to squeeze out the water, and packed them into her basket. She rose slowly, her back aching slightly, and balanced the basket on her hip. As she turned toward the path, the rider on the bridge quietly turned his horse and vanished into the fog, leaving nothing but the sound of hooves in the distance. The walk back to Pineview was long and quiet. The old house had belonged to Maeve's father before he died, but now it belonged entirely to her aunt, Beatrice Higgins. Maeve walked slowly, trying to make the quiet minutes last before the day's demands began. She did not think about the shadow she thought she saw on the bridge, assuming it was just the mist playing tricks on her eyes. At 19 years old, she had learned that the safest way to live was to remain unnoticed by the world. She believed that if people did not see her, they could not hurt her, though she would soon find out how wrong she was. When she entered the kitchen of the old house, the smell of fresh bread was already in the air. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was working at the wooden table, her hands covered in flour. She looked up as Maeve came in, giving her a quiet, knowing nod. Mrs. Gable was the only person in the house who truly saw Maeve, and her small daily kindnesses were more valuable than Maeve could ever say. "Your aunt is looking for you," Mrs. Gable said softly, pointing toward the stairs. "She wants you to fix Charlotte's blue silk dress before the gathering on Thursday evening." Maeve set her basket down and dried her hands, trying not to show her tiredness. Thursday was the big dance in the town of Silver Creek, and Charlotte had talked about nothing else for 2 weeks. Maeve had not been invited to go, of course. Her aunt had simply assumed she would stay behind to help or stand in the corner to carry things. She climbed the narrow back stairs, which were the only stairs she was allowed to use now, and found Aunt Beatrice sitting at her desk. Her aunt looked up with a cold, sharp expression that always meant she was about to say something unkind. "There you are," Beatrice said, setting her pen down. "I hope the washing is done properly this time. Charlotte's blue silk needs to be lengthened at the hem, and you must be careful with the stitches. I will not have my daughter looking messy because of your careless hands." Maeve did not reply, knowing that any defense would only make things worse. Her aunt liked to remind her that she was a burden to the family, a phrase that always felt like a cold weight in Maeve's chest. "You have your mother's restless hands," Beatrice added, looking back at her papers. "Always busy, never knowing how to behave like a proper lady." Maeve took the blue silk dress from the chair and carried it up to the small sewing room at the top of the house. The attic room was cold and small, but it was the only place where she could be alone. She sat by the narrow window, working with careful, even stitches throughout the afternoon. As she worked, she found herself thinking again about the strange feeling she had felt at the river, the sense that someone was watching her from the old stone bridge. She told herself it was just a silly thought, but she could not quite shake the memory of the quiet rider in the mist. Charlotte came into the sewing room later that day, her bright yellow curls bouncing as she moved. She was dressed in her finest morning gown, looking happy and excited about the upcoming dance. Unlike her mother, Charlotte was not cruel. She was simply thoughtless, never having to worry about her place in the world. She walked over to the table and picked up the blue silk, looking at the hem with a critical eye. "Is it almost ready, Maeve?" she asked, her voice light and cheerful. "I must have it perfect for Thursday night." "Almost," Maeve said, not looking up from her work. "I am just finishing the last few stitches on the inner lining." Charlotte smiled, sitting down on the small wooden stool near the window. "Mama says there is a new gentleman staying at the local inn, the White Pine Inn. Nobody knows who he is, but the town is full of rumors. They say he has white hair and skin as pale as marble, and he travels with a very fine horse. I wonder if he is some rich landowner looking for a wife." Maeve kept her eyes on her needle, though the description of the stranger made her hand pause for a fraction of a second. White hair and pale skin sounded like the man she had sensed on the bridge, but she dismissed the idea immediately. A wealthy traveler would have no reason to be in the misty woods at dawn. "I am sure he is just a businessman," Maeve murmured, pulling the thread tight. "The town always loves to make a story out of nothing." Charlotte laughed, shaking her head. "You are always so practical, Maeve. Don't you ever wish for something more than this tiny room?" Maeve looked up, her dark eyes meeting her cousin's bright ones. For a moment, the tiredness of her life showed on her face, the quiet ache of years spent doing chores while others danced. "Wishing does not get the work done, Charlotte," she said softly. "I have learned that it is better not to hope for things that are not meant for me." Charlotte looked slightly confused, as she could not imagine a life without wishes. But she simply patted Maeve's shoulder and left the room, humming a tune as she went. The gentleman staying at the White Pine Inn was indeed no ordinary traveler. Gabriel Winter, the Vampire King, had come to the small valley of Silver Creek because his records showed that his local land managers had been cheating the tenants. He had lived in his dark stone castle at the far end of the valley for over 100 years, rarely showing himself to the humans who lived nearby. But a sudden restlessness had brought him out of his quiet life, and he wanted to see his land with his own eyes instead of relying on the reports of others. He had chosen the name Mr. Winter to hide his true identity, knowing that the townspeople would be terrified if they knew the ruler of the valley was walking among them. But more than that, Gabriel was tired of the fake smiles and polite lies of his own court. He wanted to know if there was a single person who would speak to him honestly, without fear or greed. When he had seen Maeve at the river, her quiet dignity had struck him deeply, and he had spent the last 3 days trying to find out more about her and the old house called Pineview. He learned from the innkeeper that Maeve was the daughter of a gentleman who had died years ago, leaving her to be raised by her aunt. The townspeople whispered that her aunt treated her like a servant, keeping her away from the town's social life while her cousin was given everything. Gabriel felt a quiet anger at the unfairness of her situation, but he also felt a growing curiosity. He wanted to meet her again, to hear her voice, and see if she was as honest and strong as she had seemed in the morning mist. The opportunity came 2 days later, on a cool afternoon when the fog lay low over the fields. Maeve had walked down to the boundary fence at the edge of the Pineview land to gather wild herbs for Mrs. Gable's kitchen. She loved the quiet of the woods, where the only sounds were the birds and the wind in the pine needles. She was reaching for a patch of green leaves when she heard the slow sound of horse hooves on the damp earth. She stood up quickly, her heart beating faster as a rider appeared through the trees. It was him, the white-haired stranger from the bridge, riding a dark horse that moved silently over the pine needles. He wore a simple coat, but he carried himself with an effortless grace that made Maeve step back toward the safety of the bushes. His skin was indeed as pale as marble, and his eyes were a deep, dark gray that seemed to see right through her. He stopped his horse and looked down at her, his expression gentle but serious. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I hope I did not frighten you." Maeve held her basket tightly against her side, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, sir, you did not. But you are on the boundary of the Pineview land. The road lies back through the trees." Gabriel smiled, a small, genuine movement of his lips that changed his cold face entirely. "Thank you for the warning. I seem to have lost my way in the mist. I am Mr. Winter, and I am visiting the valley on business." Maeve looked at him for a moment, sensing something strange yet comforting about him. "I am Maeve Alden," she said simply, and for the first time she felt no fear of a stranger. They stood near the ancient pine trees for several minutes, the silence between them filled only by the distant sound of the river. Gabriel dismounted, holding the reins of his horse loosely as he stepped onto the damp grass. He did not want to appear threatening, and he could see that Maeve was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You have a very fine horse, Mr. Winter," she said, looking at the dark animal. "He seems very calm in the woods." "He is a good companion," Gabriel replied, "and he prefers the quiet paths to the busy town roads." Maeve nodded, feeling a strange sense of comfort in his presence. She was used to men who ignored her or spoke to her only to give orders, but Mr. Winter looked at her with a quiet, respectful attention. "Do you often walk this far from the house?" he asked, gesturing to her basket of herbs. "I gather plants for the kitchen and for medicine," she explained. "The woods are full of useful things if you know where to look. My mother taught me some of the old remedies when I was small, and I have not forgotten them." "A useful skill," Gabriel said. "Most people in the town rely on the local doctor, who knows very little about the plants of this valley." Maeve laughed, a soft, natural sound that made Gabriel's chest tighten. "The doctor is indeed very fond of his bitter teas, which do very little to cure a cold. I find that pine needles and honey work much better." She stopped, coloring slightly as she realized she was speaking so freely to a stranger. "I am sorry. I should not speak ill of the doctor." "Please, do not apologize," Gabriel said, his gray eyes shining with amusement. "I prefer honesty to polite conversation. The world is full of people who say only what they think others want to hear." Maeve looked at him, surprised by his words. "You must see a great deal of that in your travels, Mr. Winter." "I do," he said softly, looking toward the misty hills. "More than I care to admit. It is rare to find someone who speaks exactly what is in their heart." They walked together along the boundary path for a short distance, the dark horse following them like a shadow. Maeve found herself telling him about the valley, about the families who lived there, and about the old stories of the master who lived in the stone castle. She did not know that she was speaking to the master himself, and Gabriel did not correct her. He wanted to hear the truth of his land from her lips, without the filters of fear and duty. He listened as she described the leaking barns and the high rents that the townspeople struggled to pay. "The people say the master does not care," Maeve said, her voice quiet. "They say he stays in his castle and never looks at the people who work his fields. I think it must be very lonely to live like that, surrounded by walls and never knowing the people who depend on you." Gabriel felt a quiet pang in his heart. Her words were not angry, but simple and true, and they struck him more deeply than any complaint from his managers. "Perhaps he does not know how to reach them," he suggested softly. "Perhaps he has lived in the dark for so long that he has forgotten how to speak to the light." Maeve paused, looking at his pale face and the serious expression in his eyes. "Everyone can learn to step into the light, Mr. Winter," she said gently. "Even the master of the castle." Gabriel looked at her, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to vanish. He saw the strength in her quiet eyes, a strength that had been tested by years of hardship but had not broken. He knew then that he wanted to help her, not just because she was honest, but because she made him feel a warmth he had not felt in over 100 years. When they reached the edge of the woods, Maeve knew she had to return. Her aunt would be angry if she was late with the kitchen herbs. "I must go," she said, stepping back onto the Pineview path. "Thank you for the walk, Mr. Winter. It was very pleasant." "Thank you, Maeve," he said, using her name for the first time. "I hope we shall meet again." She nodded, and walked quickly toward the old house, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time, while Gabriel watched her until she disappeared behind the stone wall. Over the next 2 weeks, they met several times along the boundary path. Each meeting was short and simple, but they became the center of Maeve's world. She told herself that Mr. Winter was just a kind traveler, but she found herself taking extra care with her hair in the mornings, and looking toward the woods whenever she had a moment of free time. She did not understand the strange pull she felt toward him, but she knew that when she was with him, the coldness of Pineview seemed very far away. The peaceful days did not last. On a late afternoon, Maeve had gone down to the riverbank to wash a final load of linen. The sun was setting, throwing long, dark shadows across the water, and the air was turning cold. She was wrung out a heavy white sheet when she heard a loud voice behind her. She turned to see Gavin Stone, the blacksmith's son, walking down the path toward her. Gavin was a large, rough young man who had tried to speak to her several times in the town, and he always made her feel uneasy. "Well, look who it is," Gavin said, a slow, unpleasant smile on his face as he stepped onto the gravel. "The quiet Miss Alden, all alone by the river. You shouldn't be out here so late, you know. A pretty girl like you could get into trouble." Maeve stood her ground, her body going tense as she held the wet sheet. "I am nearly finished, Gavin. I am going back to the house now." She reached for her basket, but Gavin stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "What's the rush?" he asked, taking another step closer. "Your aunt doesn't care when you get back, and neither does anyone else. We all know about your mother, Maeve. She wasn't too proud to run off with a poor man, so why should you play the fine lady with me?" Maeve felt a cold wave of anger and shame wash over her. Her aunt had used her mother's name as a weapon for so long that she did not know how to defend against it. She stepped back, her heel hitting the cold water of the river. "Let me pass," Maeve said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. Gavin laughed, reaching out to grab her wrist. "Come now, don't be like that. I just want to talk." He was strong, and Maeve could not pull away. She felt a sudden, sharp fear rising in her chest, and she looked toward the dark path, wishing with all her heart that someone would come. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to turn freezing cold, and the shadows of the pine trees stretched longer across the ground. A voice, low and icy, spoke from the edge of the path. "Release her." Gavin froze, turning his head to see a figure stepping out of the mist. It was Gabriel Winter, but he did not look like the gentle traveler Maeve had known. His white hair seemed to gleam in the dark, his pale skin looked like carved ice, and his gray eyes burned with a terrifying cold power. He did not run, but he crossed the distance between them so fast that he seemed to glide over the ground. The sheer force of his presence was like a physical weight in the air, making it hard to breathe. Gavin's grip on Maeve's wrist loosened as he stared at the stranger in terror. He had never seen anyone look so dangerous, and some primal instinct told him that if he did not run, he would not survive the night. He stepped back, his face turning as white as Gabriel's hair. "If I ever see you near her again," Gabriel said, his voice quiet, but carrying a force that shook the ground beneath their feet, "you will find out exactly what happens to those who touch what does not belong to them." He did not raise his hand or make a threatening move, but the threat was clear in the very air around him. Gavin did not say a word. He turned and ran up the path as fast as his legs could carry him. disappearing into the dark woods. The coldness in the air vanished as quickly as it had come, and Gabriel turned to Maeve, his face softening instantly. The terrifying light in his eyes was replaced by a deep, worried warmth as he reached out to help her. "Are you hurt, Maeve?" he asked, his voice gentle and smooth once more. Maeve stood shaking, her heart hammering in her chest, but she did not feel afraid of him. She felt only a deep sense of relief that she had never felt before in her life. "No," she whispered, her hands still trembling as she looked up at his pale face. "I am not hurt. Thank you. Nobody has ever stood up for me like that." Gabriel looked at her, his heart aching at the sadness in her voice. "You should never have to face such things alone," he said softly. "As long as I am here, you will never have to." Maeve looked into his gray eyes and felt a tear slip down her cheek, realizing in that moment that she had given her heart to this strange, white-haired man who had appeared from the mist. The news of the white-haired stranger's intervention spread quickly through the village, and it did not take long to reach Pineview. Aunt Beatrice was furious when she heard that Maeve had been seen by the river with the mysterious guest from the White Pine Inn. She called Maeve into the parlor the next morning, her face tight with anger. "What is this I hear about you and the traveler?" Beatrice demanded, her hands slamming down on the table. "You have been meeting him in the woods, making a spectacle of yourself, and bringing shame to this house." "He only helped me, Aunt," Maeve said, keeping her eyes on the floor. "Gavin Stone was stopping me from leaving, and Mr. Winter made him go." Beatrice let out a cold, sharp laugh. "Mr. Winter? Is that what he calls himself? You are a fool, Maeve, just like your mother was. I have heard from Mrs. Gable and the village gossip that this man is no traveler. He is the owner of the Coldwater Hall estate, the reclusive master who rules this valley. He is a creature of the dark, Maeve, and he only plays with you because you are a simple country girl who does not know any better." Maeve felt the room spin. "The master of Coldwater Hall?" she whispered. "Yes," Beatrice said, her eyes narrowing with a cruel satisfaction. "He is the vampire king who has lived in this valley for generations. Do you truly think a man of his standing, a king who has lived for centuries, would care for a penniless girl who washes laundry? He is only using you to amuse himself, and when he is tired of your simple face, he will throw you away. A king does not marry a servant, Maeve. He only plays with them." The words felt like a heavy blow to Maeve's chest, knocking the breath from her. She did not want to believe her aunt, but the memory of Gabriel's terrifying power at the river made her wonder. He had moved so fast, and the air had turned so cold. He was indeed the vampire king, the ruler of the valley. She felt a deep, painful ache in her heart as she realized he had lied to her about his name and his life. He had kept his true identity a secret, letting her believe he was just a simple traveler who shared her love of the quiet mornings. She spent the rest of the day in the sewing room, her tears falling onto the gray silk dress she was fixing. She felt foolish for having trusted him, for having allowed herself to believe that someone could look at her and see something worth loving. She resolved to see him no more, knowing that the distance between a human girl and a vampire king was too wide to ever be crossed. She would stay in her quiet room, doing her work and letting the world pass her by, just as she had always done. Meanwhile, Gabriel had returned to his grand estate, Coldwater Hall, feeling a deep sense of worry. He had seen the look of hurt in Maeve's eyes when she realized his true power, and he knew that the townspeople would soon tell her who he really was. He did not want her to learn the truth from the cruel gossip of the village, or from her aunt, who would surely use it to hurt her. He resolved to go to her and explain everything, to tell her that his love was real and that his title meant nothing to him compared to her. He rode to Pineview the next morning, his dark horse moving quickly through the misty woods. He hoped to find her at the boundary path, but she was not there. He rode all the way to the edge of the old house, his white hair catching the pale light of the morning sun. He saw her through the window of the sewing room, her head bowed over her work, her shoulders looking smaller and more tired than before. He wanted to call out to her, but he knew that entering her aunt's house would only cause her more trouble. He waited by the old stone bridge near the river, hoping she would come down to wash the linen as she did every morning. But the river remained empty, the water rushing past the cold stones without her. Gabriel sat on his horse for a long time, the weight of his long life suddenly feeling very heavy on his shoulders. He had lived for centuries without caring for anyone, but now that he had found her, the thought of losing her was more than he could bear. He knew he had to find a way to show her that he was the man she had met in the woods, not just the cold king of the castle. The invitation to the grand ball at Coldwater Hall was sent out the following day. It was a formal event, the first one the master had held in over 50 years, and the whole valley was invited. Gabriel had organized it for one reason only: to bring Maeve to his house, where he could speak to her in public, and show everyone that she was the woman he had chosen. He hoped that she would have the courage to come, and that she would allow him to prove his love to her before the whole world. The news of the ball at Coldwater Hall threw Pineview into a state of wild excitement. Aunt Beatrice spent all her time planning Charlotte's gown, her hair, and her jewelry, wanting her daughter to look like a princess. She was determined to catch the eye of the Vampire King, believing that Charlotte's beauty would be enough to win his heart. "We must be perfect," Beatrice said every day, her voice sharp with ambition. "This is our chance to rise above the other families in the valley, and I will not let anyone ruin it." Maeve was kept busy from morning till night, sewing ribbons, pressing lace, and helping Charlotte with her preparations. She did not complain, but her heart felt like lead. She had decided not to go to the ball, knowing that she could not bear to see Gabriel dressed as a king, looking at her from his throne while she stood in the dark. But Mrs. Gable had other plans. The kind housekeeper had found a beautiful length of gray silk that had been put away in the linen chest for years, and she was determined to help Maeve make a dress of her own. "You are going to that ball, Maeve," Mrs. Gable said firmly, finding her alone in the kitchen one evening. "You are a gentleman's daughter, and you have as much right to be there as your cousin. Mr. Winter, or whoever he is, saved you at the river, and I saw the way he looked at you. He did not look at you like a servant, Maeve. He looked at you like you were the only thing that mattered in the world. You must go and show them that you are not afraid to be seen." Maeve looked at the gray silk, its soft surface catching the light of the candle. She felt a sudden spark of her mother's spirit rising within her, a quiet refusal to let her aunt keep her hidden in the dark forever. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. "I will go." They spent the next 2 nights working in secret, cutting and stitching the silk until it fit Maeve perfectly. The dress was simple, without the heavy lace and gold ribbons of Charlotte's gown, but it was elegant and showed the quiet grace of her movements. When the night of the ball arrived, the sky was clear and full of stars, and the dark castle of Coldwater Hall was ablaze with thousands of candles. The long road up the hill was lined with carriages, and the sound of music drifted down to the valley. Maeve, dressed in her gray silk, her dark hair pinned up softly with a few silver pins that Mrs. Gable had given her. She looked at herself in the small glass and felt a strange sense of peace. She was no longer the frightened girl of the riverbank. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead. When she came down the front stairs, Aunt Beatrice and Charlotte were already waiting in the hall, wrapped in their heavy cloaks. Beatrice turned to look at her, her eyes widening in surprise and immediate anger. "What is this?" her aunt demanded, her voice rising. "Why are you dressed like that?" "I did not give you permission to wear such things, Maeve. You are meant to be helping your cousin, not trying to compete with her." "I am going to the ball as a guest, Aunt Beatrice," Maeve said, her voice quiet but steady. "I have made my own dress, and I will not stay in the carriage." Charlotte looked at her cousin with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You look beautiful, Maeve," she said softly, before her mother could stop her. "The gray silk is very lovely on you." Beatrice looked as though she wanted to send Maeve back to her room, but she knew that the carriage was waiting, and there was no time to argue. "Very well," she snapped, "but you will keep to the edges of the room, and not embarrass us." They rode to the castle in silence, the carriage moving slowly up the winding road, through the dark pine trees. Maeve looked out at the stone walls of Coldwater Hall, feeling a mixture of wonder and fear. The castle was huge and ancient, its high towers reaching into the night sky, looking like a place from an old story. When they stepped out of the carriage, the cold mountain air felt fresh on her face, and she took a deep breath to calm her beating heart. She walked up the stone steps, determined to hold her head high. The great ballroom was more beautiful than anything Maeve had ever imagined. The walls were lined with dark wood and covered in silver mirrors that reflected the light of the massive chandeliers. The floor was made of polished stone that gleamed like ice, and a large orchestra was playing a lively tune from the gallery above. Maeve kept to the side of the room, watching the elegantly dressed guests as they moved through the dance, her heart searching the crowd for the one face she wanted to see. Maeve stood near the heavy velvet curtains, trying to blend into the shadows as her aunt had commanded. She saw Charlotte being swept into the dance by a handsome young man from the town, while Aunt Beatrice stood nearby, looking around the room with a proud, searching expression. The guests were all whispering about the master of the castle, wondering when he would appear. "They say he has not been seen in public for 50 years, an old woman near Maeve said to her friend. "I wonder if he is as terrible as the old stories say." Suddenly the music stopped, and a quiet fell over the entire room. The heavy doors at the end of the hall opened, and Gabriel Winter walked in. He was dressed in a dark coat with silver embroidery, looking every bit the king he was. His white hair fell softly over his pale forehead, and his dark eyes swept over the crowd with a cool, regal authority. The guests bowed their heads as he passed, a mixture of respect and fear showing on their faces. Gabriel did not look at any of them. His eyes were searching the edges of the room, looking for only one person. When he saw Maeve standing by the curtains, his cold face softened instantly, a warm light filling his eyes. He walked straight toward her, ignoring the polite curtsies of the other women and the eager looks of their mothers. Aunt Beatrice moved forward, trying to position Charlotte in his path. But Gabriel walked right past them without a glance, his eyes fixed on Maeve. He stopped in front of her, his hand reaching out to her with a quiet, respectful grace. "Miss Alden," he said, his low voice carrying through the quiet room. "I have been waiting for you. Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Maeve looked at his pale hand, then up at his gray eyes, seeing the same gentle traveler she had met in the woods. The fear and doubt she had felt for the last few days seemed to melt away under his gaze. She placed her hand in his, feeling the cool, steady warmth of his skin. "Yes, Gabriel," she whispered, using his name instead of his title. The orchestra began to play a slow, beautiful waltz, and Gabriel led her onto the polished stone floor. They moved together with an effortless grace, as though they had danced 1,000 times before. The other guests stepped back, watching them in silent wonder. Maeve felt as though they were the only two people in the room, the music and the candlelight fading into the background as she looked into his eyes. "You came," Gabriel said softly, his hand holding hers gently. "I was afraid you would not forgive me for my silence." "I was hurt," Maeve admitted, her voice low. "I thought you had lied to me because you thought I was just a simple girl who did not matter." Gabriel shook his head, his white hair brushing against his shoulder. "I kept the truth from you because I was selfish, Maeve. For 100 years, I have been surrounded by people who saw only my title and my power. You were the first person who saw me as a man, and I wanted to keep that feeling for as long as I could. I love you, Maeve, not because of your family or your station, but because of who you are." Maeve felt her heart swell with a happiness so deep it felt almost like pain. "I love you too, Gabriel," she whispered, her dark eyes shining. As the dance ended, Gabriel did not let go of her hand, but turned to face the crowd, his posture proud and protective. Aunt Beatrice stood nearby, her face pale with anger and shock as she saw her plans ruined. She stepped forward, her voice carrying across the room as she tried to make one last attempt to humiliate her niece. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice shaking with forced politeness. "Surely you do not know who this girl is. Her mother brought great shame to our family, running off with a poor artist and dying in poverty. Her parents' marriage was a hasty, irregular affair, and there are many who say she has no right to her father's name. I have the letters to prove it, and I will not have this house's reputation ruined by her presence." A murmur of shocked whispers ran through the crowd, and Maeve felt her face turn red as she tried to pull her hand away from Gabriel's grip. But Gabriel held her hand firmly, his face turning as cold as ice as he looked at Aunt Beatrice. The air in the ballroom seemed to grow heavy, and the candles flickered as if a cold wind had blown through the room. "Mrs. Higgins," Gabriel said, his voice quiet but carrying a cold authority that silenced everyone in the hall. "I suggest you be very careful with your words. I have already had my own lawyers look into Miss Alden's family history. Her mother's marriage was perfectly legal and was recorded in the bishop's registry, which my men have already found. Your letters prove nothing but your own cruelty." Beatrice stepped back, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. "Miss Alden is the daughter of an honorable gentleman," Gabriel continued, his voice ringing through the room. "And she is the woman I have chosen to be my wife. Anyone who speaks ill of her or her family will find themselves no longer welcome in this valley, or in my house. I trust I have made myself clear." The guests bowed their heads in silent agreement, and Aunt Beatrice, her power completely broken, turned and walked quickly out of the room, leaving her daughter behind. The silence that followed Gabriel's words was filled with a quiet respect, and Maeve felt a weight that she had carried for 19 years lift from her shoulders. She looked at Gabriel, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude, and knew that she would never have to hide in the shadows again. Charlotte walked over to them, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked at her cousin with a quiet, sincere expression. "I am sorry, Maeve," she said softly. "I should have stood up for you long ago. I was too selfish to see how much you were hurting, and I hope you can forgive me." Maeve looked at Charlotte, seeing the genuine regret in her eyes, and felt the last bit of her anger melt away. "I forgive you, Charlotte," she said, reaching out to touch her hand. "We were both raised in a hard house, and I do not hold the past against you." Charlotte smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek, and dropped a small, respectful curtsy to Gabriel before walking away to join the other guests. It was not a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and Maeve knew that they would find a way to be friends in the future. The wedding was held a month later, not in the grand stone castle of Coldwater Hall, but in the small, simple wooden chapel at the edge of the woods, near the river where they had first met. It was a beautiful autumn morning, the trees covered in red and gold leaves, and the mist rising softly from the water. Maeve wore her simple gray silk dress, her dark hair adorned with a few wild white flowers that Mrs. Gable had gathered for her. She walked down the aisle alone, her head held high, looking toward the white-haired man who stood waiting for her with a warm, steady smile. Gabriel watched her walk toward him, his heart filled with a peace he had not known in centuries. He did not care about his title or his power. He cared only for the brave, quiet woman who had looked into his eyes and seen the man beneath the king. They exchanged their vows in front of Mrs. Gable, Charlotte, and a few of the local farmers who had come to wish them well, their voices steady and clear in the quiet chapel. When Gabriel kissed her, Maeve felt a warmth spread through her chest, knowing that she had finally found the home she had been looking for all her life. After the ceremony, they walked down to the riverbank together, their hands held tightly as they looked out at the water. The sun was rising over the pine trees, throwing a warm, golden light across the misty valley. The river ran steady and quiet, just as it had every morning of Maeve's life. But she was no longer the lonely girl washing linen in the cold dawn. She was loved, and she was free, and she knew that the future ahead of them was full of hope. Mrs. Gable and Charlotte were waiting for them at the carriage, their faces bright with happiness as they waved. Gabriel helped Maeve into the seat, his hand cool and steady against her skin, before climbing in beside her. As the carriage began to move up the hill toward Coldwater Hall, Maeve looked back at the old stone bridge and the river, feeling a deep, quiet gratitude for the morning a white-haired rider had stopped his horse to watch her work. I used to believe that safety was found in being invisible, that if I stayed in the dark sewing room and never looked up, the world would leave me in peace. I thought my mother's choices had left me with a debt of shame, that I would spend my whole life paying off with raw knuckles and heavy baskets of linen. But as I sit here beside Gabriel, watching the sunlight break through the ancient pines of the valley, I realize that the truest kind of safety is not hiding from the world, but being seen completely by someone who loves you for exactly who you are. The future no longer looks like a long, cold road of chores and unkind words. It looks like a quiet forest path, where we will walk together, season after season, learning to understand each other's worlds. Gabriel has lived for centuries in the quiet shadows of his stone castle, and I have lived my short life in the quiet shadows of my aunt's house. But together, we have found a place where we can both step into the light. My mother did not leave me a legacy of shame. She left me her courage, her belief that love is worth whatever price we must pay for it, and I will carry that courage with me into the long years ahead. The river will continue to flow through the valley, and the mist will still rise from the water at dawn, but I will never walk those banks in loneliness again. For I have found the one person who saw my quiet dignity and chose to walk beside me forever.